Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I am Adrian Di Pietrantonio. I'm EVP of Global Platforms and Partnerships with Dubber. I'm joined here today by Sean Winter from Mobius. And we're going to talk to you about end not knowing and end compliance uncertainty by using Dubber and Mobius as a solution. So thanks very much for your time. We're going to take around 30 minutes today to try and keep the session short, and we'll open up to any questions you might have towards the end of the session. If you do have any questions, please drop them into the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel there, and we'll address those at the end. All right, perfect. So let's make sure this is working. All right, so what we're seeing across the globe today is really increased complexity and demands around the requirement for regulated industries ranging from gaming through to travel, entertainment, even government, and really seeing a bunch of these different drivers and industries fall into buckets that all have different types of complexity and demands around being able to capture the voice data and insights for those different regulatory drivers. So we're seeing enormous complexity in industries like financial services and financial organizations today, that are subject to regulations that don't just exist here in the US, but really around the world in places like Australia, the UK, and Europe, and far beyond. Most of those drivers are multi-geo, and they're subject to regulatory demands, not just from the regulators, but also industry bodies such as the government organizations, reserve banks. And this complexity is really being driven now because of, and multiplied due to things like COVID. So we're now in this sort of notion of work from anywhere, and that's dominating the marketplace, and given birth to the requirement to be able to capture and record multiple endpoints across the organization. As an example, I sort of think back to time walking into a bank in Australia, in Sydney, where you were required, and employees were required to check in their mobile phone at the front desk, because they didn't allow anyone to use it whilst in the organization, because they weren't sort of leveraging unified communication platforms. And employees today really expect to be able to converse with people and customers, clients on all of the different mediums and means that are available to them from anywhere, not just in the office. So that really says to us, okay, we've got a landscape that's very complex. We've got multi-geo and multi-different regulatory demands that span the world, and depending on the geographic zone that you sit in, when you're doing business across those different geos and different channels, you need a solution that's going to be able to help you to capture all those different endpoints and different channels that are coming through into the organization. So really, one, addressing the complexity across those multi-geos and regulatory demands. Two, that's multiplied by COVID and having employees dispersed across the US or across multi-geos and having different endpoints, whether those endpoints are things like Microsoft Teams, Cisco WebEx, Zoom phone, etc., or really the service providers on the mobile networks or traditional VoIP networks. You need to be able to have a solution that sits across all of those different platforms and service provider solutions in the market, and be able to capture all that data and capture all those crucial conversations sitting across those. We're also seeing, it's time to end not knowing, know your customers, being able to investigate on a deep level across what's happening within the conversations, making sure that those organizations really are able to investigate and review calls on a near real-time basis, make sure that they're hitting customer demands, and do all that in a way that's cost-effective. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly, but being able to have a solution that sits across multi-geo, multi-platform in a way that allows the customer to, or the enterprise to be compliant and have a solution deployed across those different voice data sets and meeting all the regulatory drivers at the same time. Again, data and device dispersion, siloed data. Historically there was really an inability to be able to run queries over disparate solutions. You might have a customer that has a solution in their contact center, albeit solutions in the contact center were widely only sampling a small percent of conversations, not the entire amount of calls that was coming into the organization, and then not being able to capture any of the mobile calls, or if they did have disparate solution, not being able to run a query on a live basis, in real time, like a Google search, for example. They were hit with having to run things like SQL queries over disparate data sets, and that would take anywhere up to half an hour to be able to come back with a result, and they would have to do that multiple times per day, in opposed to being able to do that on a live basis. And then really part of that compliance chasm is risk mitigation. How do we ensure that we've got this continuous compliance, the ability to report and have surveillance over all the conversations within the organization? Too many controls here, sorry. There we go. So what we're seeing is that today, 80% of crucial customer conversation are still captured in voice and augmented with digital. And when we say voice, we're talking about not only the verbal communication, but we're talking about different types of voice, so whether it's chat or whether it's different mediums that we're able to take the data from the voice conversation and really be able to leverage it. So we're still seeing a very high percentage of those calls and those conversations kind of transacting over a voice medium. Historically, less than 10% of crucial conversations are captured. So you imagine where an enterprise has contact center recording in place, we're not looking or we're not seeing anything outside of that canned environment being captured. So, and this is where we'll get into the notion of our UCR and the ability to have multi-platform, multi-network endpoints captured for that enterprise and having an enterprise-wide view of what's happening. As we said, less than 10% of the actual customer interactions are being captured. That means that any of the face-to-face or conversations with, if you take into consideration financial planners, etc., none of those one-to-one conversations that are sitting outside of those historical or traditional networks were being captured and being able to ensure that we're meeting regulatory drivers and risk mitigation across those calls. If you take into consideration where we're at today with respect to with COVID and employees being dispersed, working from home, working from anywhere, we hit these new challenges. When I say we, the enterprises hit these new challenges in being able to capture that data in a cost-effective manner, and to be able to aggregate that data back into a centralized point is a real challenge before Dubber and Mobius. Excuse me. 50% of the customer conversations in financial institutions, as I just sort of leaned into, were happening outside of the contact center. So, they were happening when people were calling into different departments for banks, for example, calling through to the financial services team or financial planning team, where they sit outside of that core team taking account inquiries or loan applications, for example. So a large volume of the actual interactions with the customers were not able to be captured because the technology wasn't able to be deployed across multiple networks or multiple platforms. Again, 61% of financial services CFOs plan to make remote work permanent for roles that allow us. So I think just last week or the week before, you would have seen that Salesforce, for example, announced that they have 3 different modes of work. We're seeing this across many large enterprises, really easing the work restrictions and easing the requirement for people to go back to brick and mortar offices and having to sit within the legacy technology solutions that were deployed within those environments. We're now talking about planners, analysts sitting behind, knowledge workers sitting behind their Microsoft Teams environment or WebEx calling or a UC VoIP solution from the service provider from their home office or from remote offices, hubs, etc. So the ability, the need to be able to capture all of those calls has never been more prevalent across multiple different solutions. All right, so like if we look at the landscape across these different regulatory drivers around the world, things like MiFID II, Dodd-Frank, APRA, PCI, SOC, FCA, FINRA. There's many different drivers around the world that are they're becoming more and more prevalent. And within those drivers, there's certain nuances. For example, PCI, you need to have the tools available to you to be able to have set retention periods, for example. So you need to be able to leverage AI within those different regulatory confines and regulatory drivers to help to automate some of the solutions to meet those drivers. So, for example, instead of having like legacy solutions where you're having to manually be involved to purge data or set retention periods, etc., we're now able to leverage what we have in the platform between Double and Mobius to automate or automatically set these retention periods, set the time in which data is stored within the system. Drastically improve response times, example for getting back to customers by automating some of the business insights and processes off the back of the data that we're capturing within the actual platform itself. Really leveraging AI and ensuring that security and fraud detection is front of mind, and that we're putting the best interests of the customer and the obligations of that financial services provider at the front of mind for not only the business but for the end customer also. I'll just stop for a second and just mention that if you do have any questions as we go along, as we're going through these slides, if you could put them into the chat box at the bottom there, that'd be great. So I guess the world that we live in is really changing, and to be able to meet these different drivers around the world, which are really coming from a host of government and regulatory bodies around the world, and ensuring that we're utilizing AI and the platforms and technology to really hit those obligations and make the solutions that we provide to service providers and financial services provided key to hitting those obligations. So one example of those is FINRA, so challenges for financial services firms. So the scope of communications, really looking at how do we ensure that we're capturing all of the communications within that organization, within that enterprise, and not only the voice calls, but things like tickets, trade confirmations, records, text messages, etc., and have that all aggregated into a platform that can leverage that data set and provide a compliant solution back to the enterprise. Again, being able to have customizable retention periods. So whether it's 3 years or 7 years, depending on the geo that the compliance mandate sits within, the platform and technology really allows us to customize that solution back for the end user and ensure that they're being compliant, not only within the regulatory confines, but also within their own InfoSec or their own internal regulatory drivers.
Adrian, did we lose you? I think you went quiet. I don't know if your mic went out.
Apologies, somehow that microphone got muted. So
Oh, no problem.
just to sort of step
Welcome
back. So when you think about the notion of capturing all these compliant conversations, one of the first steps is ensuring that we're actually able to capture that information from the networks and remove the ability for the actual employee or the enterprise to get in the way of not capturing that call. And the way that we do that is by really integrating with the service provider or the platform provider at the core. So providing this at a network level at the heart of the solution, given whether that's via a service provider with Dubber or with Movius, really removing the controls from the end user and making sure that we can't get around the compliance requirements for that enterprise or the regulatory drivers. So we're capturing all of those messages. We're capturing all of the conversations. A good example of that might be credit card data that's captured as part of that conversation, and not having it visible to other parties, making sure that we're hitting all of the privacy laws and being able to keep all that data secure and safe. But sort of the second idea is also making sure that organizations that have really struggled to apply AI and see how it can help them generate alerts and manage messages back out around that data to meet regulatory standards. And by this I mean there's a lot of outdated ideas around how you can apply AI across these solutions today. Really, what we're saying is we're ensuring that this AI is actually meaningful and it's applied in a way that gives us a way to quickly report and respond to some of the conversations that are happening within that enterprise, i.e. large financial services, etc. All right, so at the start of COVID, you would have seen that a lot of the compliancy and expectations were put on hold, or a more lenient view was taken as to how we move forward and enforce some of these different regulatory compliance mandates that were put in place. What we're seeing now is that the brakes are off. I think that organizations, enterprises were given a period of time where they were allowed to ease off because of the fact that people were working from home, working off disparate systems. And now we're seeing that really reverse. Speaking to, as an example, the FCA, for example, has come back in pretty strong, saying that we now need to start ensuring that all of these different platforms and technologies have the ability to capture those calls when working outside of the office. And that's really where we shine, being available across hundreds of service providers around the world, directly integrated with those service providers at the core, means that we can really capture any conversation, whether it's within one geo zone. So in the US, for example, you might take any of the large service providers here where we're deployed directly into the wireline networks, and then with Movius across mobile networks also, being able to capture all those mobile conversations and add them into what we call our voice data cloud, and really aggregate that singular point across the organization to capture those calls, and then you leveraging our AI to provide further functionality and meet the regulatory mandates that we're seeing. Okay, so I think an integrated approach to meet this continuous compliance and the mandates that we've been talking about. I think the first major requirement we've seen is, like I've said, is being able to apply our UCR, our Unified Call Recording, across multiple networks and platforms, and ensuring that we're meeting all of the data and privacy regulatory drivers within the geo zone, whether that's data sovereignty, meeting the minimum retention periods in terms of how we apply things like legal hold or automated retention and storage periods for that particular regulatory driver. And we've seen that really the pressure points around that are historically having disparate data sets, not capturing all of the different voice communication lines or media channels that have been that are part of that mandate, and having the ability or inability to record mobile phones. So that's really one of the first requirements is how do we capture all of this data across one geo or multiple geos around the world, and then centralize that data or aggregate that data to a point where we can then leverage it through our APIs, etc. Really, then the second requirement is understanding through our voice intelligence cloud, like knowing that we've captured all the data, that we're meeting the mandates, we're up to speed with the regulatory standards, we're able to report off the back of the data that we actually capture. Again, that's where the voice intelligence cloud really shines, allows us to remove these siloed sets of data across an organization, allows us to aggregate it, allows us to then run reports on a real-time basis and have that information come back straight back into the organization to ensure that they're responding to customer inquiries instantly, not having to go and run these legacy queries or processes to run those legacy queries across disparate data sets. Really having and being tapped into that customer and understanding what's happening within the organization as it unfolds across multiple networks. And then really the requirement of being able to report and respond. So knowing the customer, NPS scoring, keyword searches, really being able to, via the APIs, report very easily across and access that data across multiple geos, have the appropriate people being hooked in and being able to see the reporting and leverage the data sets that we're able to capture across those multiple networks and disparate voice networks. So historically, we saw less than 1% of the calls being reviewed, and that was due to legacy solutions, legacy applications not having open APIs, not having these rich voice data sets accessible via their APIs or via integrated BI tools such as Salesforce or Tableau or Microsoft BI. Any of those different BI tools, they would have to take data, format the data. It was very heavy lifting and very difficult for them to be able to leverage the big data sets and do it in a very quick manner. So an integrated approach really allows us to hit all of those requirements that are really driven from the regulatory drivers, and they all have different levels of requirement, but the actual platform in the voice data cloud allows us to deliver those into the organizations. Did it again, I'm sorry. So really, how can this unified communication, so unified call recording and conversational recording with the AI overlay help those organizations? So if we're looking at compliance data sets, really having this non-refutable data set that allows us to meet all of the, whether it's legal hold, whether it's automated retention, whether it's using AI to automate those processes around the compliance or the regulatory drivers to make the enterprise compliant within those constructs. Being able to capture conversations from any endpoint and any app. Our UCR approach allows us to have a view into the whole of business instead of just having that pre-canned contact center or maybe having some of the regional offices captured. This is really taking a broad brush approach to the entire organization and ensuring that every conversation, irrespective of where it's taking place around the world, is captured and then centralized to a point where we can leverage the value within that. Being able to easily and automate some of the compliance breaches, whether that's via alerts and reports or real-time search. The voice data cloud and the overlay of our voice AI solutions allows us to automate a lot of those compliancy mandates and understand when there has been a breach. accelerating investigations, for example. So respond quickly to audits or investigations, provide accurate sets of data back via the applications, and provide proof of conversations, for example. All of these different insights are easily accessible via the voice data cloud and via the double cloud with Movius. And then sort of more traditional coaching and staff training, we look at how are we monitoring staff conversation and enabling training for compliance. I'll go a step further and talk about health and well-being within employees, within dispersed workforces today. What's the mental health and how are our employees handling this new world and this new world of dispersed employees? And sorry, I just saw that you can't hear me, but you can. And meeting those different drivers that we're seeing within businesses today. Okay, and then looking at sort of a really high level, not too deep approach at what we can look at and leverage from this next generation of conversational compliance. So the ability, once again, to capture every communication, whether it's voice, look at critical productivity amongst the staff, the efficiency and compliance needs, being able to then convert that data and the capture of those calls into data sets that can be used to manage, share, and inspect and collaborate within the organization to improve customer satisfaction, customer outputs, and of course the regulatory drivers that we've been talking about. Being able to connect, this is a big one. Leveraging the AI, which creates insights, alerts, data sets for reporting to critical compliance mandates and business performance, whether that's via API or integration. This big data set across the organization is now available because of the unified call recording approach across multi-channel. And then historically, affordability and accessibility, the cost, and we'll talk about that a little bit further down the path. But having a solution that's simple and affordable and can be deployed in a heartbeat, can be deployed very easily, is something that we haven't seen in the past, because it would require a disparate deployment or equipment going into different sites, for example. This is not that. This is lighting up the networks at the core and having the technology available as part of their voice, communications. Oops. And again, leveraging AI, bringing in those enterprise controls, making sure that we're providing all the features and tools to hit those different enterprise requirements. Turn any of those calls into searchable data and intelligent data, and then again via our APIs, making sure that data is actually accessible to enterprises. And when we say accessible, making sure it's accessible and consumable in a format that can be leveraged by these big data tools, for example. We recently, I won't say which, but just deployed between Dove and Movius into one of the into a large Swiss bank, and what we're looking at there was a couple of different compliance and problems around ensuring that we were capturing all of the calls throughout the organization, whether it was mobile or historic. Making sure that we weren't missing situation where there was rogue trades happening or calls happening outside of the traditional networks, and then meeting the need to have automated transcripts and access to that information as it happens, and also of course the cost to do that was a problem in the past. So Movius and Dubber, we were able to come to the party and deliver a compliance solution which allowed us to do that. It allowed us to provide real-time access to calls and real-time search, provide the transcriptions in the required. They had a requirement of 9 different languages in this situation. I think that one in particular was Hebrew, but really giving them the breadth of options in terms of how we can deliver those transcriptions in the portal. and then using and leveraging the keyword and key phrase notifications for surveillance and alerts within the organization. So there's a solution that gave the bank 100% visibility of the conversations, doing it in a very efficient way, straight from the core of the network, straight from the mobile calls, and gave them the confidence they needed to understand that they would be alerted if there was any breaches, and that the fact that they were meeting the regulatory mandates that they needed to meet within their industry. Another situation with an Australian bank recently, they had traders who were sort of dispersed around APAC and around the world, obviously weren't able to capture all of those disparate networks and disparate discussions because of the amount of different providers that they were working with, not having the solution within the network, weren't able to capture the conversation across different networks or devices, or as we've talked about, and then not being compliant was obviously a big problem as a result of all of that. So we worked directly with the service providers in each of the countries, ensured that we had the solution in place, and now that organization, the bank, is able to be compliant across all of the networks that those traders work across, ensuring that we capture all of the calls, and that those calls are then stored compliantly within the country of origin, which as a platform provider, we need to ensure that we are meeting all of the data sovereignty and compliancy rules around how we store that data for PI, etc. And then effectively access to those calls and compliant capture and storage across any additional calls that were happening globally as a result of that deployment. I'm going to talk about, I'm just trying to set the scene here as to how the combination of Dubber across service providers and with Movius is able to meet any of the regulatory drivers that we talked about earlier. In particular, this one, we were able to a question that comes up when talking to financial services providers who are used to heavy deployments that take months on end to be installed and trained, etc., within their contact centers across the organizations. This removes all of those legacy issues because we're tied in directly either with a service provider or in partnership with Movius. This is a solution that can be effectively click to deploy. It's deployed very, very quickly. In this case, it was 15 days with a large Asian bank. We took away all the issues around MiFID II compliance. We're able to register and activate the customers within minutes, so the endpoints within minutes. And they had the solution deployed and operational within 15 days. Now that means they've got a single repository for all of the calls, conversation, data, transcriptions, all of that stuff into one centralized point. And to have that across multiple countries and geo zones was something that hit pretty significantly and rang home for the customer with what is really a very simple and effective solution across the bank for that geo solution. I guess now to sort of lean into the cost of this, the risk of not knowing, the risk of non-compliance to a business in the form of continued disruption, revenue, productivity losses, etc., on average equates to 2.7% roughly, or 2.7 times the cost of having an effective solution like this in place. If a bank's not compliant, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the questions, the disruption to the organization can be immense. The negative PR, all of that, and I guess fines that come down from the regulators is something that is at front of mind for all these organizations. And between Dubber and Movius, we're able to deploy a solution very quickly and very effectively to ensure that we're not having partners and customers in that situation where they're non-compliant. Being able to look at the continuous conversation, whether that's via an integration via the API, for example, via Salesforce, having the data immediately available and accessible for reporting, for interrogation for looking at how the employees are working with the customers, how they're treating customer experience, etc., is something that this solution between Dubber and Mobius really brings and solves in a very cost-effective and simple way. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking there and open it up to you guys for some questions. I think there's been a couple of questions that have come through. Sean, I think if we look at those, I'll might hand over one of those to you. For example, one of the questions that came through is, what are the 3 main compliance challenges that you're hearing from clients today, and how do we help solve those?
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. And just to give a quick intro on myself and Mobius. My name is Sean Winter. I'm Senior Vice President of Strategy and Global Client Success. So work a lot in corporate strategy and development, but also spend most of my time doing running all of our field-based operations and client-facing work. And this is a good question. So Mobius is it's an interesting product. It's basically around compliant mobile calling and messaging, primarily for client-facing teams. So there are a lot of solutions out there that allow, as you know, employees to talk to other employees in compliant ways. But once you go outside of the network or the firewall, things can get very dicey, as evidenced by your talk and your slides. So we provide a full gapless solution, which we'll get through in a second, I think, for that need. So whether you're on a carrier network or on data, Wi-Fi, we can cover you with all of those and ensure that the right data gets to a system like Dubber for the right analysis. But as far as your question on some of the challenges that we see from our clients, I think the first and foremost is just, I hate to say new normal, but the hybrid nature of work going forward. As we know, about a year ago, I think everyone went from usually being in the office or on airplanes back to working from home. And we're still there, but we'll probably end up with some kind of hybrid approach where maybe you're home for 2 days a week, you're in the office for 2 days a week, you're in between or traveling for another day. I think, Adrian, you had mentioned that something like 61% of financial services firms are going to make remote work permanent for those that can do it. So this is certainly here to stay. And I think the notion of how do we give our employees compliant tools to do their job, to interact with their clients, knowing that they're not going to be in the office every day is a huge one. The second one we're seeing a lot of is just companies coming to terms with the fact that their clients like to communicate in a different way, maybe than they have historically, or then a company communicates internally. So just the notion of texting, whether it's over SMS or messaging over a tool like WhatsApp, those are channels, again, that clients prefer to use. They're using it anyway in their personal life. Why can't they use it with their financial advisor or their investment banker? So we're seeing a lot of interest there to say, hey, not everybody loves to make phone calls. How can we contact our clients on the channels that they use today? And the third one is obviously the regulatory piece. I think you mentioned a stat around, the cost of compliance is I would think the cost of non-compliance is 2.7% that of compliance. I think the total amount of fines last year were in the tune of 10 billion, over 10 billion for regulatory fines. 80% of which were in the United States. So it's a substantial thing. We talk often about the opportunity cost of not doing anything. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of regulations. I think the US specifically, we're probably coming out of a federal government that was very into deregulation. And now as we come out of COVID and into a new administration, I think that pendulum is going to swing pretty quickly the other way. So I would expect, regulations not only to not go away, but to increase over the coming years.
Yeah, great. That's great. And I guess, how are clients balancing meeting short-term compliance gaps with shifting to long-term compliance framework?
Yeah, this is one we're seeing a lot of now. I think when the pandemic first hit, as you all know, it was a scramble, right? I think everyone was looking for what we'll call like Band-Aid approaches, right? We know you're going to be home. Please use this tool when on your laptop because we think we have a compliance story around it. Now that's changed in that, okay, the world's fundamentally different now in terms of where and how people are working. And the world's fundamentally different now in terms of how clients like to interact with the companies that they work with. And so I think that the idea that, again, the Band-Aid approach now is kind of shifting into a full reevaluation of how regulated firms manage their mobile footprint. Do big banks really need to be in the phone business, right? Or can they, can they go with a more modern SaaS or app-based approach that not only allows them to record everything they need to record, but then analyze that for, for productivity, for efficiency, client satisfaction, you name it. And, there are a lot of solutions out there that either work over a carrier telco type of network, or if you think about more app and eSIM solutions that work when you have a great data connection. And we're the only one at Movius that really works over both. So if you are in a true hybrid work environment where some days you're home, some days you're at the office, some days you're in between, you know that not only with the Movius service, you'll always have coverage and the ability to make calls, messages, etc. But specific to Dubber, all of that information will be captured and then can be used in whatever kind of futuristic artificial intelligence ways you deem fit.
Yeah, great. I think there was one other question around, how to ensure that the same level of provisioning for compliance, whether it's voice, hardware, voice, CCTV, trading floor hubs, etc., has the same level of compliance applied to it. I think if we could talk a little bit about how our joint solution would solve this.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, it's more that how the world of mobile is, has fundamentally changed due to the pandemic. And so whether you are at home, in the office, on the trading floor, we need to think not in terms of, okay, here's an iPhone that is owned by the company, go be good. And we need to say, look, people are interacting with other employees, clients, folks on the trading floor, you name it, in just fundamentally different ways now. And we have to look at it sort of more in a device agnostic way to say, okay, how can we provide channels that allow point A to connect to point B? How can we capture the content that's in those channels for compliance purposes? And then how can we analyze that data to make the company generate more revenue, to make the company more productive, more efficient, to make it, more cost controlled, et cetera. So I think that's the shift that something like a Movius plus Dubber really opens up, right? And that we don't need to think of this in such a siloed way around, hey, let's give everybody a phone. In fact, there are cheaper, better alternatives that are way more inclusive than just hoping that everybody uses a corporate liable device for every phone call, right? Because we know, to your point, people are just interacting in fundamentally different ways right now, whether it's in person, whether it's over video conference, whether it's over a variety of audio communication devices, whether it's a phone or whether it's a VoIP solution like a Zoom or a Microsoft Teams or whatnot. There's just a lot out there, and I think everyone now needs to take a step back and think of this more holistically in terms of how are employees really contacting clients and the other people they work with, and do we have a really holistic and compliant view of that?
Yeah, great. All right, so thanks very much for that, Sean.
Absolutely, thank you, Adrian.
Yeah, no worries. So I think that brings us to the end of our time here. Really appreciate everyone joining and listening to us talk about how we help to meet these really drivers within the financial services and regulated industries, and look forward to engaging with you. If you have any more questions, please shoot them through. We'd be happy to set up a follow-up session with you and talk about how we can help sell through and help meet any of those drivers.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Adrian. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sean.